Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. And tonight we have a special guest along with Mike, as you can see here, an interloper. And otherwise, we're just going to pretend that there's no cat on the screen trying to distract everybody's attention. We're going to try to pretend. It's probably not going to work very well, but, you know, we're professionals here. We don't get distracted by cats. I mean,
it's a SQL cat anyway.
Yeah, okay, so we do actually get distracted by cats, but we're gonna pretend that we don't. So, with me tonight, as always, Mala Mahadevan. How you doing, Mala?
Hello, everyone. Sorry for the glare behind me. I'll close the door in a minute. But nice to be here. Hello, everyone.
Yeah, for sure. And back to us from Space Canada, which is a lot like regular Canada, but in space, Mike Christensen. How's it going, Mike?
Bonsoir. Doing well. How are you?
Fantastic. And Mala has now decided to abandon the show. She's like, nah, I'm done with this. But again, we're professionals. We know what to do here. So the idea of Shop Talk, pretty simple. We get together. It's Monday. There's a cat. We're just going to talk about stuff. If you have questions, chat, get them in there, and we'll talk about your topics. Otherwise, I will probably try to derail myself as we have a few topics to discuss. So before we get going, the cat does want us to know that past Summit, you can still sign up for that. The discount code of Azure175 is still active, but you know, this is coming up pretty soon, so you might want to get that in. Speaking of getting it in, we do have a survey, a TriPass survey, the semi-annual survey, which means once every 2 years, not once every 6 months. So it's been 2 years. It's time for a new survey. If you have not already, we would definitely appreciate you filling that out. It's what helps drive us as an organization. It helps us understand what it is that everybody wants and how we move forward. There are a few questions about whether we go hybrid and try to get some in-person plus online events, or if we stick to online only like we have been. As well as several other questions, SQL Saturday, topics of discussion, that kind of fun stuff. So it takes just a few minutes, and your thoughts will help drive the user group for the next couple of years. So get that in, and we would appreciate it. Next up, one quick little thing about SQL Saturday Richmond. So SQL Saturday Richmond was this Saturday. Had an opportunity to get up there, see some of the folks. Anders was around, so it was good to see Anders in person again. There were some good people in Richmond, and nice to get with them again. The SQL Saturday itself hosted at the same place where they'd done it before, although it was under new management. And that cat just walking back and forth, I see it every time. I'm like, I must continue saying my sentence, but you know, every time it's like, oh, there's a cat. Especially long hair cat, so probably a lot of fun to pet. But good event. I would say that it was definitely smaller than a normal SQL Saturday Richmond, and I think that's a constant that we've seen so far, that everything is a smaller SQL Saturday X. Orlando had probably about a quarter of their normal turnout. Richmond had about a third to 40% of their normal turnout, and a couple the other ones I've been to, you know, they've been smaller events. I think it's going to take a little while. I expected that there would be more take up on, oh hey, here's an event in person, let's go do it. But there hasn't been that level of take up yet. So I guess we'll see what happens over the next few months. But even so, it was good to be able to see some people. We aired an episode of the SQL Data Partners podcast, or recorded an episode live.
Oh, cool.
Oh, I must watch that, Kevin.
Yeah, it was definitely stream of conscience, or consciousness, either one, depending on whether we have consciences. I'm pretty sure I do. I don't know that Eugene does. He seems pretty sociopathic, if you ask me. I only say that because Eugene doesn't watch this. No, but yeah, I had some fun with that recording. Should be out. It should be episode 257. 256 will be airing at some point, and we just have to record it first. But that'll be a big expo show, and then 257 will be talking community from Richmond with a microphone and cracking up our editor who was watching the camera. One interesting thing that came out of that was a little bit of a discussion around one of the talks that I gave. So I gave a talk on window functions and their importance, their value, how they've changed in various versions of SQL Server, specifically pre-2012 and post-2012. Because I didn't have 2022 installed on my machine, I couldn't show off the new window clause. But
oh, they have it.
Yeah, that's been added in 2022. So you can define a window as, say, W or W1 or whatever, and then reference over W1 instead of over. Is
that really all that useful, Kevin?
Oh, yeah.
It is. You think so?
Oh, definitely.
For finding a window, and you reuse it over and over. Okay. I was like, okay, this is a good idea, but I wasn't sure how useful it would be, maybe to some people.
Yeah, if you're doing anything that involves 2 or 3 or 4 analytics functions in the same query, it can make a big difference. Maybe it's not that many lines of code saved, but what it does is ensure that you get that window right, that you're using the same window, and if the window changes, you get it updated in all 4 spots instead of just the one. So
that makes sense. That's
fewer mistakes. Because Postgres has it and SQLite has it. But that's awesome. That's great. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and this kind of gets to the main topic of the evening, which is talking about keeping up to date with T-SQL. Because in that talk, I mentioned string ag, which was released in 2017. It is technically not a window function. It is an ordered set function. We know that because window functions have the over keyword, and string ag does not have an over keyword. So technically not a window function, still kind of fits in the same principle. But as I showed that off, a person came up to me afterward, and I heard her talking to a colleague beforehand. She's an Oracle person, spent a lot of time working with window functions, was training this person a little bit, and came up to me afterwards and was saying, I had no idea that this thing existed. I'm going to have to go update a whole bunch of code now. And yeah, that's a great reaction. And it's led to an idea that, well, in a lot of cases, we write code that it worked fine. It was possibly even the best choice at the time that we wrote it, but that as time goes on, new features come out. It's good to go and give those a look and see if there's anything that's been updated that maybe improves the situation a bit. So string ag is a great example of that. If you were using stuff and 4XML path to create comma delimited lists or semicolon delimited lists or whatever, then string ag is a simpler way to explain the operation to a normal human. And also performance, I've never actually noticed a performance difference, but in fairness, I tend not to connect together 100,000 record sets. So maybe Mala does, and that's why she dropped on us. Like, forget you people. You don't join 100,000 records together, you don't deserve my time. But yeah, in general, I haven't noticed a performance difference. But it is a lot easier for a human to read. It's a lot easier to explain to somebody who doesn't understand the mechanics behind the stuff function, or how it is that 4XML path actually works, and why that would generate a delimited list. So,
well, on that point, yeah, one of the books, the window function books, had some good examples. Maybe it was the Eat Sick book, but of how it used to be done versus how you could do it now, which I thought was very illustrative. And there's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, some databases are old and you wouldn't necessarily be able to refactor code when you're talking about a pre-2012 database. But they just tend to be way more verbose. Like you can just do it in fewer lines of code and make less mistakes. I like that part of it, is making fewer mistakes because you're referencing something instead of retyping things over and over.
That's
trying
true.
to get back.
Yeah, Mala just gave us notice that her internet went out, so that is a occupational hazard. So it wasn't just because we don't join together very large record sets into comma delimited lists. So maybe it was a factor. But, you know, to the point, if you're working with an older system, even going back to 2012, I think there was a lot of functionality that has been added into SQL Server over the past decade that people don't even necessarily think about. And I would say, hey, go give it a try, see if it's useful. Some of the stuff that's been added, yeah, sure, it's not going to be very useful for your scenario. Some of it, maybe the performance isn't good enough, or it doesn't quite have the functionality that you need. And in that case, okay, that's fine. But, you know, in a case like string ag, where, oh, I was looking for something that did this exactly, and now I can make life so much easier. So in 2012, I mean, one of the biggest examples was the update to window functions, being able to include the over clause on aggregate functions, for example, so that you could have a sum over and create a running total. Whereas before, there were a couple of options for running totals. You could do a self join and get the sum where a value is less than or equal to the current value. Performance on that is awful. It's a real dog. There was a quirky update that was fast, but technically depended on a strange property of clustered indexes in SQL Server. A property that could have been patched or changed literally any cumulative update or any SP or anything else, and in which case would have broken a whole bunch of code. And it was not valid from the standpoint of Microsoft that this is supported activity, which meant that if it did break, the Microsoft response might be, oh, that sucks. You should use something in a way that's supported. You shouldn't assume the way that the physical layout of rows in a table works, because we don't make any assumptions about that. We don't surface any assumptions about that. Or a cursor, which usually was the fastest option pre-2012. But then a simple sum operation with an over clause, and now you have your solution, much faster than a cursor, much less code than a cursor, way faster than self-join, possibly orders of magnitude faster than self-join, and did not rely on undocumented behavior like the quirky update. But yeah, in addition to that, I mean, there's several other functions like concat to combine together strings and other data types. One of the nice things about concat is that you're able to connect together different data types. So I could have a string, a number, I could have a thing that is null or not null, I could have decimals, and they all get combined together as an output to a string, essentially. So I'm able to combine these together without having to think too much about, do I have a null or not? Do I have to do is null checks? And do I have to cast this as in varchar first? Or is it going to be implicitly convertible to a string type? And even within string types, varchar and in varchar. So concat takes care of a lot of that work for you and makes putting together complex strings as output results a lot easier. Yeah, go ahead.
I was reading about SQLite's take on data types, and they had a nuance that I thought was interesting, which is that they're not weakly enforced; they're flexible. So they say, you know, if it's a number and you write a number, it'll guess that you meant it was a number, right? So I thought that was interesting the way they said it. It's a feature, and of course, the traditional database systems are very strict with data types. But it is good to have a concat that is flexible like that, because also another example of like fewer errors to debug.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the best uses of concat I've seen is doing checksums on entire records to see if there's a change. So in a warehouse, if row A in the table matches row A in my ETL process, and if I need to make a change to that row at all, so I can get the checksum on both sides of all of the columns concatenated together, maybe with a separator involved, and bam, then I've got my check. And that process is going to be a lot easier than doing all of those is null statements, is null checks. So works out pretty well that way. Another thing from 2012 that I think was, people may not have remembered so much, but the try cast and try convert functions. I would also throw in try parse as well, although try parse doesn't perform very well at all. It's great. I love try parse. It's just that if you're doing this for 100,000 rows, try cast and try convert are just as fast as cast and convert. Try parse is nowhere near as fast. It's about 2 orders of magnitude slower, so huge difference. But whereas cast or convert, if you have the wrong data type as an input, you could get an error. So for example, if you have the string cat as your input and you try to cast that as an int, you're going to get an error. If you try to convert it to an int, you're going to get an error. If you use try cast or try convert, you get null. So that behavior isn't going to break anything, and as long as you know to check for null later, then in your code, you're able to either return back nulls in a result set and not throw errors, or you would maybe perform some checking logic to see, is this value null, or is it, technically that doesn't make sense. Is this a null here, or do I have a value? If it is null, then set some default value or go perform some lookup someplace, and we're able to tie that together in a way that is going to work with existing logic versus simply throw an error because I found at least one record that did not convert correctly. So it's just a matter of understanding that the behavior has changed. The practical implementation is a little bit different, but I think that for a lot of cases, this is more of, you know, what we're looking for when we cast. That really we want to try cast, but it's fairly rare that I see that in practice, despite how useful.
Yeah, we have cast in a lot of code because it's ANSI compliant, but you know, I'm finally in the place that I said I would be in 2018, but we started a subgroup on SQL Server because we are going full bore. We're going to actually get off Oracle completely.
Hey, good.
So I will be try casting. What's that?
Get that monkey off your back.
That's right. I'll be try casting and not too charring it, you know, the rest of my days, hopefully.
Yeah, to char with any date. I still have bad memories of that 15 plus years later. So that was 2012. And 2012 was a really big change when it came to new syntax. 2014, I don't even have anything. There probably were a couple of things. And of course, if you're talking about features and functionality, things like in-memory OLTP came into existence. But I'm focusing mostly here on the type of application code that we would write in T-SQL and that we would expect to have, that this could make an improvement. So, those types of functions. Or in 2016, a couple of simple things really made life a lot easier. And one is create or alter. So especially with stored procedures and functions, create or alter procedure. That way I don't have to check to see, does this procedure exist? And if so, create it, otherwise alter it. I just say create or alter. And it just works.
I do that a lot too, yeah.
Yeah. It makes
create or replace. I think it's create or replace where we create.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, in the T-SQL example for things like procedures, it's create or alter. And makes a whole lot of sense just natively to have this thing going as part of a deployment process that you can easily rerun. It makes your statements, it makes those procedure creation statements idempotent. So I can run it once, twice, 3 times. I still end up in the same state at the end with the procedure looking like the shape that I expect. Great for CI/CD processes where I don't know how many times this is going to run, but I can assume it will be at least 1. And if it's more, then I need to be able to support that. Similarly, on the other side, we have drop if exists. So drop if exists says, does this thing, is it already there? If so, yeah, let's give it a drop. Otherwise, do nothing. So I can drop a table if it exists, drop a procedure, drop a view, drop a function. It doesn't drop, not all objects have drop if exists support. Not all objects have create or alter support. Like tables, you can't create or alter a table. But drop if exists has a little bit more functional support in practice. And again, allows for those deployment scripts to be idempotent, allows you to easily generate something that I am okay with burning down later. And my other example of something that was nice in 2016 that may allow you to reduce some or refactor some code and make life easier for you. A little bit more controversial, string split. So string split, as it was put into 2016, gave you back a value, and that value was the string that was split out into 1 or more or 0 or more value results. In other words, string split is a function that returns a table, and that table includes 1 column value. And if you have, for example, a comma separated values list, then it would have 1 row per value between those commas. Generally useful. The reason it's a little controversial is that you don't necessarily have the same ordering. You don't really have a way of defining ordering or of reshaping the order after the split. All you have is the unique set, or not the unique, the full set of split values. In 2022, they have added a parameter to enable whether or not you want to have ordinals, so that the first value is 0, the second is 1, the third is 2, and so on. And then you could sort by those ordinals. That is not bad. I know that there's still some people who want more out of string split. I think it's an improvement. It is listening to the community and getting a bit better with that function. And it replaces a lot of really poorly written code. There are still faster string split options. I think some of the tally table options are still faster. I know that CLR string splitting is almost certainly faster, or at least as fast. But string split is pretty fast. It is definitely faster than function-based approaches. It may be faster than most tally table-based approaches. I'd have to go back and read the tests. I think Aaron Bertrand did a bunch of testing on string split and performance at some point, and I'm pretty sure a couple of other people have as well, but I don't have any of those numbers in front of me because who does show prep anyway? So that was 2016. There wasn't necessarily a whole lot in terms of T-SQL. I think there was a fair amount, but that it felt like when I was going back and looking at what are the most useful things from the standpoint of just a developer who wants to update their code, it felt like most of the biggest improvements were around the deployment scenario. Ironically, 2017, which we think of as kind of a blah release, if Linux wasn't your thing. If Linux is your thing, 2017 was an awesome release. That was when we got SQL Server on Linux. If you're big on containers, SQL Server 27 was an awesome release because, again, we got SQL on Linux, which allowed us to containerize it effectively. Because Windows containers, friends don't let friends use Windows containers, folks. Containers on Windows, yeah, that's fine. Windows containers, let's pull back a step here.
Wait, so you're saying if your hypervisor or if your host OS is Linux, you're not making a Windows environment from that? Is that what you mean?
My recollection is if your hypervisor layer or if your operating system is Linux, you can't create a Windows container to begin with. You don't have the.
That's what I thought too. Yeah, that's what I thought too.
But if your operating system is Windows, you have two options. You can create a Linux container using Windows Subsystem for Linux, or previously Docker Desktop had its own version, its own set of Linux executables that it could use to emulate the environment, or you built a Windows container. So the container itself was running Windows, and Windows containers never really got much love in the community or from Microsoft. At this point, I'm not even sure that anybody officially supports them. I know that there were a couple of companies that put together containerization for Windows containers. I don't know if they're still around or not. They might be.
So essentially, if you have a virtual machine that's different than a container, like
virtual machines are very different. Running Windows on a VM, you can run Windows from a Linux-based VM. I do that. You can run Linux from a Windows-based VM. Done that.
You're talking about like containers, like Kubernetes and Docker and.
Yeah, Docker specifically, or whatever variant on Containerd you want to play with. But for the sake of using common public terms, yeah, having something run in Docker, where the difference is that with a virtual machine, you're sort of virtualizing the hardware. You're saying, hey, let's make believe that we have this hardware, and now we're going to install an operating system on it. We're going to allocate it disk. We're going to allocate it memory. Containers, we're saying, hey, make believe you have this operating system. And then on top of that, we'll have code and storage and whatever else layered in. So
yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's why historically, when it originally came out, you needed Linux or some Unix variant to run containers because it needed the Containerd service, which was going to be available on Linux and BSD. And you needed the operating system bits for whatever operating system you were faking when you were executing a service within a container. And then Windows and Mac OS got it, Mac OS being a very, very distant relative of BSD, more and more distant as the years go by. And Windows, being Windows, needed a lot more code. They needed a lot more put into place to allow for the containerized services to actually work. But we're at a point now where, yeah, I can run Linux-based containers on Windows and expect that they'll work just fine.
Gotcha.
Just, we can't run Windows-based containers anywhere and expect them to work just fine. So that's the moral of the story. But, you know, going back to 2017, like I said, I think that was sort of the big, what people remember. But there were a few smaller things that made it into the T-SQL space in 2017 that I think were really useful. One of them is concat with separator, or concat_WS. So we talked about concat, released in 2012, allowed you to say, combine together multiple attributes of different data types, and it would just smash them all together. So if I wanted to create an insert statement, and maybe I wanted to specify insert into dbo.table, and in parentheses I have all my column names, and I say values, and I open parens, and now I want a string that comes from some other table. Well, I need to have the single quotes around my string. I need to have a comma at the end, and then I need to go to the next thing. And I need to repeat that with comma, with comma, with comma. Concat WS essentially says, you know what? I've got a group of things here. Just take all of them and combine them together and have my separator be a comma, or a comma and a space. And then what I'll have is one string that has my entire comma separated output. So I might even have put the single quotes around my values. So could include those as part of the separator, and very easily generate a statement that would allow me to insert these records into a temp table or into somewhere else. Or maybe I'm reshaping the data in some fashion.
That is cool. I'm gonna practice all these.
Yeah, so that's concat WS. I've only used it a few times, but when I do remember to use it, it's very useful.
All those little savings add up.
Sure, and you know, the thing of it is that you may find once every 6 months, oh yeah, I could use this, and then that'll make it a lot easier to understand what my code is doing. Or I could use this and it'll make my code faster. Or it'll save me 3 hours of writing a different approach. So it's not something that maybe you'll use every day of the week. But when you do need it, it comes in handy.
Yeah, we found something called replace, which I had never heard of. I don't know what the equivalent would be in SQL Server, but essentially it was like, if you see a dot, replace it with this.
Yep.
And it normally you don't need to use it, but it really helped with this certain thing we were doing. And then another buddy helped with what he was doing. So it was a good time saver, and it's good to know in your toolbox, but I wouldn't use it all the time.
Yeah. So the equivalent of replace is replace. And
look at that! I just saved 5 minutes learning.
I'm trying to remember what the fellow's name was. He was he ran the U.S. men's soccer team for a little while. He's a German. He was a German defenseman. He played for FC Bayern Munich in the 70s and was huge on the German national team. But anyhow, he had this little shtick going where in German, he'd be talking to the German press in German, and then every once in a while he would pick a German loan word like t-shirt. And so he'd be talking, and then he would say, "Oh, what's the German word for t-shirt?" like he didn't understand the language. But that's sort of what that reminded me of with replace. Like, hey, what's the T-SQL version of replace?
It's
replace. And actually, what's funny is that you have anticipated successfully the next item on my list. Because the next item on my list is called translate. So replace... replace allows you to do a swap. Every time you see an open paren, I want you to replace that with a square bracket. Well, translate allows you to take at least one character, and I want to replace anything in those characters, in those, like square bracket, open brace, open paren. Let's replace all of those with open parens. And so translate does sort of a one-for-one, first character here, first character there type of translation, and will replace an entire string that way. So if you have certain characters that you just want to get rid of, if you have certain characters that you have like a one-to-one replacement of braces with commas or something. Maybe you have pipe delimited fields and you want to change it to semicolon delimited. Then translate will allow you to do that. And unlike replace, will allow you to do more than one character at a time. So it's not character combinations. So it's not like the OK. So the letter O and letter K, you're looking for a two-character string OK. Instead, it's more like I'm replacing the character O with something every time I see it. I replace the character K with something every time I see it. Which means that you need to have just as many things on the right-hand side that you're replacing with as things on the left-hand side. So you can't replace the letter O with number 1, 2, 3. It has to be a one-to-one correspondence.
Yeah, I think the use case for us was like these ICD codes, which are like EO 7.1, and there's a list from the government which doesn't have any periods whatsoever, and then the periods are in different spots depending on the type of billing system, so they're not consistent. They're not consistently right in the like the third character slot, or that's not. They're not consistently in the same spot. So I think I used replace and just said replace the dot with nothing.
Huh. Yeah, and in that case, that's something that translate wouldn't necessarily be able to do so well. That's a job for replace. If you were replacing the dots with commas because you're switching to German, that's a good case for translate.
Gotcha.
Now the next thing, we already talked about string ag. String ag is going to give you the ability to concatenate together multiple values from a table or from an input set and generate out one or more strings that have delimited values. Incredibly useful within its relevant circumstances, and something that is a bit of a time saver in terms of writing code and understanding how to make that work right. Way better than building your own function. Performance is at least on par with stuff in 4XML path, and as a result, I think it's absolutely worth taking a run through anytime you have 4XML path in your code and seeing, does it make sense just to switch that with string ag? Because it probably does. The other one, this is a really small one, but it's a quality of life issue, and that is trim. Because for decades, SQL Server had ltrim and rtrim, left trim and right trim. Ltrim and rtrim did their jobs, and so in so many code bases, you would see ltrim, rtrim, whatever, and then 2 closed parentheses. Well, we have trim. Trim is a replacement for ltrim and rtrim. It will, by default, perform both ltrim and rtrim, but you can actually specify that you want to just trim the preceding or you want to trim the trailing and not both. Or you could say, I want to do both. Interestingly, you can also specify what characters you're trimming, because ltrim and rtrim do not trim out tabs by default. Neither does trim. However, you can specify that I want to include char 9, which is a tab stop, maybe also char 30, which is vertical tab, and whatever other white space spacing characters you have, and trim those out as well. So you can concatenate together a set of the characters that you want to trim from the left and the right sides, and run that with trim. Again, makes life easier, makes it so you don't have to do replaces of char 9 with char or with a space. So makes life a little bit easier that way. 2019, again, interesting release. There was a lot of stuff that came out for it. In the working with legacy SQL area, I don't know that there was that much. I think the biggest item that I could think of was approximate count distinct, where if you're doing count distinct on large data sets, it can take a while for that to finish up. If you have tens of millions of rows and you're running this on not really fast disk, yeah, it might take 30, 40 seconds to get to the distinct count of results. If you only need an approximate, approx count distinct gives you a guarantee that it will be no more than 2.3% off. It can do that because it uses an algorithm called hyperlog-log, which is a, there's some academic papers around it about how it all works, but essentially it's a approximation algorithm that builds off of sampling the data and guarantees that it will be within a small percentage of the actual value, which is really cool. It is also 3 times, anywhere, when you're talking about a large enough data set, you may be looking at an order of magnitude faster. If you're looking at a moderate data set, yeah, you may be looking at 3-4 times faster just by switching to this. So if you don't need the exact number, if you just need a feeling for, do I have millions of distinct values? Do I have thousands of distinct values? Do I have dozens of distinct values? Then this is going to give you that feeling for cardinality much more efficiently. So that was about the only thing I could think of with 2019, that there wasn't too much more. Again, there was a lot in the broad product space around machine learning services, around Polybase, around availability group updates. You know, there's a lot in there, but within the kernel of T-SQL that's been running for 20 plus years in people's code bases, I think approx count distinct is one of the few things that you could easily go to and say, yeah, I could replace some 15-year-old code with this. And with 2022, it's not out yet. So for all the people who bet on Ignite being the release date for SQL 2022, didn't work out. Admittedly, if I had put a bet on it, I would have bet on Ignite. So I would have lost that bet. But it's coming out soon. I mean, definitely within the next 2 months. Again, they're not going to embarrass themselves by releasing SQL 2022 and 2023. You would hope.
Probably not.
Probably. Almost definitely. But there's a few things in here. One of them, greatest and least. This is something that I have wanted for a very long time. And the idea of greatest and least is horizontal min and max. So what I mean by that, min and max are aggregate variables. So I want to find the max value of a column. So they're aggregate functions off of a variable. Find the max value of a column. Well, what if I want to find the max element or the max attribute within an element, or the max value within a tuple? That's what greatest and least allow you to do. So I could say the greatest of A1, B1, C1, D1, give me that back. And the least of A1, B1, C1, D1, give me that back. Going to make it a lot easier to perform comparisons where I don't necessarily care which column that value is in. I just need the largest of those columns. Maybe I have time trials and I want to find what was the fastest trial. So I may find the least in T1 through T5, where instead of restructuring the table. So greatest and least kind of helps you sometimes when, hey, maybe I didn't normalize this table appropriately and I need a little helping hand to get out of it. But also it could be I need to find what is the greatest value of these things, which are different and don't belong in a tall table, but they are actually different attributes that mean different things. It is just that they are cross-comparable.
And will it do it only for the same data types?
I'm pretty sure. I haven't done a lot of thorough testing. I did some testing with different numeric types, and so it'll implicitly convert to things like decimal or float from integer in big int. So it will catch different numeric types. With strings, if I remember right, I can't tell you for sure.
But you don't think that it would natively bring back a string as the biggest value?
Well, if you have two strings, cat and dog, then it could use the character values and do sort of a lexicographical ordering of character values. So the char value of D is greater than the char value of C for some specific casing. And so greatest might give you back dog instead of cat. But I don't want to confirm that. I don't want to say for sure. I do know that max and min do work off of strings as well. So That's what you'll see from a max or a min. And so you might see it also from greatest and least. Another thing, something that we saw in the Azure SQL Edge, the IoT device version of SQL Server, date bucket and date trunk. So date buckets especially we saw in Azure SQL Edge. And date trunk comes from Oracle and Postgres, that world, both of which allow us to group together dates, and date trunk especially. Hey, I just need to know what the hour of the day was. So show me the current date up to that hour. And you can do that in SQL Server with some weird combinations of date diff and date add. But it's not easy. It's not easy to explain, and you kind of have to think through what you're doing in order to get the right dates. With date trunk, you essentially say, lop off everything after the hours. That's all I need. Or lop off everything after the minutes. So I need the date and I need hour and minute, but I don't need seconds.
Yeah, we have that. It's extract year from date or minute from date or whatever.
Yeah, so this is different from date part. Date part is where I'd say, give me the hour number or give me the year number.
Mm-hmm.
I would hope that least and greatest with strings would use regular sorting based on current or supplied collation, not code point values, unless binary collation is being used, but haven't tested yet. Yeah, I haven't tested it either. I can't even confirm that greatest and least do absolutely work with strings. I'm making an assumption that they do, but I don't know for sure. Also, session context in SQL 2016. Yeah, that's a good one. Interestingly enough, we ran into some session context issues with replication, but that's a story I was not directly involved in. But being able to collect some information and store like some variable of who you are or what you're doing here or what is the importance of this session, that is very helpful for administration. So I'm gonna put that on my list.
So speaking of that, how do I check my? Do you know? Is there something where I can check my privileges and like, what I'm allowed to do?
Yep.
SQL? I was looking for that earlier today, and then I got distracted.
Yeah. So there's a function.
SP user or something like that?
No. FN my permissions. So the function FN underscore my underscore permissions, this is going to allow you to see what it is that you are capable of doing. What's nice about this is it goes beyond basic checks of permissions and includes everything that is relevant to your current account. So if you're part of if you get explicit grants, you get implicit grants, like you're a member of a group. You can also get other information about, say, things that have been explicitly granted to an Active Directory group to which you belong. I have a blog post on it as well. I'm dropping in chat here.
Oh, you do?
In
Cool.
which I call FN my permissions and get some ideas of what's in there. What I would love to see, but is probably never going to happen, is being able to get that FN my permissions for another person. And I had a chance to talk to a buddy of mine at a SQL Saturday not too long ago. FN my permissions just happened to come up, and I mentioned my lament that this works really well. It is the only way I'm aware of that I can definitely see everything that I can do. But as an administrator, I would love to see what Bob could do. Now, I can execute as user Bob and then run FN my permissions on the database and get an idea. But if I don't have the ability to impersonate that user, there's no way that I can pass a username into FN my permissions. And I guess the reasoning behind this is this function is all handled at session login time. So you connect to SQL Server and it spends the time figuring out what your permissions are and then stores those and makes it available to FN my permissions. So that way it doesn't have to recalculate what all your permissions are, because that can take a little while, especially if you have a whole lot of permissions on a whole lot of databases and a whole lot of environments where you've got things laid out very granularly. It may take a little bit of time to sort out what exactly you can do.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I really appreciate that, because we're the first thing that we're tackling is permissions and like what we're allowed to do in terms of stored procedures and triggers and stuff like that. And we got to sort it out, but it's slightly different than Oracle. So like I kind of log in as a service account, but I can use Windows, Windows Active Directory to log in, and then it just knows that I have permissions to these schemas, grant, write, revoke. Like and so I've seen the SQL that gave me the permissions, but in Oracle, I can kind of like quickly find users, groups, and privileges. And I wrote a script for it and I just like hotkey it. I use it all the time. So this is good for me. And then my colleagues, it'll be perfect. And then I'll work on something else for my users, because I'm not going to bring them in yet.
Yeah. So that's probably the best way to do it. It's the most comprehensive way to do it for sure. So in 2022, it is shaping up to be, I think, a pretty good release for useful T-SQL statements. We talked about date bucket, greatest and least, updates to string split. Generate series allows you to build a tally table. So you don't have to have a common table expression that cross joins the number 1 with itself, or create a physical tally table. You can generate a series and get it that way. Generate underscore series. We did talk about window function updates, where you can define a window frame and make use of that frame repeatedly. That feels like it's going to be a pretty good quality of life update, especially for analytics people. And then following on from approximate count distinct, there are a couple of functions, approximate percentile continuous and approximate percentile discrete, that allow you to get the percentiles for your data sets, again, within a few percentage points of accurate value. So if you have a large data set, this will give you a very fast result. A classic problem, you could get percentiles in 2012. There was the percentile continuous and percentile discrete window functions, but they were amazingly slow. They were staggeringly slow even. And so the performance was just awful. Once you got past hundreds of thousands of rows, I couldn't ever recommend it. It would be faster prior to 2022 to take your data, send it into R or to Python running machine learning services, perform the percentile calculations and machine learning services, and return the results back than it would be to do the work within SQL Server itself. That gives you an idea of just how slow this was. Approximate percentiles, much faster. I had a chance to test that out on an early release, and it was, I think my basic tests were like 7 to 10 times faster. So maybe even more than 10 times faster with larger data sets. But when it came down to it, it went from I would never run this because I don't know that it'll finish to this is not taking very long. So that's more of a niche case. But if you're in the same type of boat where, look, I don't need to know exactly what the median is or exactly what the 95th percentile response time is. I just need to know approximately what the 95th percentile response time is. Is it 12 milliseconds? Is it 12 seconds? And if I'm off by 5%, I don't care. This gives me an order of magnitude operation that I can mentally look at and say, yep, our system's going fine, or our system's not going fine. I can't remember if SQL Server has insight into Active Directory or Windows group membership of a Windows login. I think it might be impossible to get permissions for someone not logged in, as permissions will depend on whatever Windows groups a Windows login is a member of, and that might only be known when the Windows login connects and all groups are part of the current security context.
Makes sense.
That could be a factor, yes. SQL Server does have some insight into the group membership of a login, at least or the other way around, the membership of a group. So there is that stored procedure that will allow you to check Active Directory and get the members of group X. But yeah, that it might be that you can't get those permissions as well. So that could be a second reason why my fn someone else's permissions function would never fly, which is a shame because I think as an administrator, that is really important to understand who has access to do what kind of awful things in the system. And this was one of the best. This is the best way to do it as far as I can tell. So that was our whirlwind tour of all the different types of functionality that I think is relevant when you're dealing with older code bases and you're thinking, how can I modernize this, or how can I take advantage of new functionality? So hopefully you got something fun out of this tonight. I'll have in the show notes, I'll have some links to this.
3 pages.
Excellent. And I will note that this is actually part of an update to a talk that I'm giving on working effectively with legacy SQL. So I'm rebuilding the talk for the Azure Data Conference in Las Vegas in December, and including a lot of this as a type of content. Much of this was technically possible via SQL CLR since 2005. This is true that you could define a lot of this yourself. Some of it.
I wonder how he feels
so
about SQL command line.
What's that?
I wonder how he feels about SQL command line.
About SQL CLR. Yes.
Yeah.
Let Let us wonder what the person who created SQL Sharp thinks about SQL CLR. So yeah, you're right, Solomon. A lot of this you could do yourself. Some of it, it's pretty obvious that they did in fact just use CLR under the covers, like parse and try parse and format. You see the .NET errors that occur when there's a problem with it. So in other cases, some like create or alter, drop if exists, that's stuff that you couldn't, or truncate table with partitions, that you couldn't necessarily do. But yeah, generate series, string ag, format, part of SQL Sharp years before they showed up as built-in functions. Right. And that's kind of the power that CLR has that unfortunately a lot of people were afraid of and therefore banned it because, fire bad, fire scary. But that is something we have lamented multiple times here on Shop Talk, and we are at the top of the hour, so we're gonna call it for this evening. Thanks for tuning in, and
this was the greatest, the least and greatest version of Shop Talk.
I see what you did there. String split via CLR never lacked the ordinal. Oh, that's just cold now, Solomon. Don't go rubbing it in on them. But remember, tomorrow we're gonna have Heidi Hastings talking to us about sensitivity labels, Power BI, and the Microsoft in the Azure space, tying in with Microsoft 365, and seeing how you can help organizations understand the importance of particular columns and ensure that certain data doesn't get exfiltrated. Least and greatest do work with strings. Okay, that is good to know, but not with varchar max or anything exceeding 8,000 bytes. Yeah, that list there, that kind of looks like the standard list of we're going to support most of the stuff, but not the weird things. So, okay. Greatest and least do work with strings. My guess is that the behavior would be similar to what min and max do today. But again, that's just a guess. And with that, let's wrap things up. Thank you, everybody. Until we see each other again, take care.
Bye-bye.